thank you very much for joining us today. Hello there. Hello. Um, so I'm Caroline Bald and I'm the co-chair of the Criminal Justice Group alongside Helen, who will be sharing a presentation today for the first hour. I'll introduce her and her presentation in a minute. So hopefully you have a cup of coffee or tea. Happy for you to have cameras off as well if you're having a cheeky sandwich, Andy. But please, you're more than welcome to engage. And as Helen has said, and will say, a lot of this webinar is also about discussion and conversation. So just to introduce my colleague and chum in arms, Helen Woods. Helen is a lecturer in social work at the University of Birmingham, and her specialism is looking at youth justice through a critical lens. And Helen has kindly agreed to share with us her view of the current state of youth justice at pretty much a very critical time in the UK with the cost of living crisis and also the expansion of the penal estate and schools. So again, thank you for agreeing to do this, Helen. I know this subject is dear to your heart, and I'm very looking much forward to hearing your presentation. So if I hand over to you now, thanks. Over to Helen.
That's great. Thanks, Caroline, for kicking us off. So I'm Helen. Before becoming a lecturer, I was a youth justice practitioner for quite a long time. I've also done social work and child protection. I started out as a probation officer many years ago now, when we were still allowed to do that as social workers. So a lot of my kind of work background is in youth justice and related areas. And I miss working with young people sometimes, and families. So it's nice to see you all. Thanks for coming along, much appreciated. So my aim today really isn't so much in some ways presenting my view, it's trying to get yours. I'll share my presentation. What I'm hoping for really is for us to look at the current state of play in youth justice based on what we know, and to have a conversation about what that means in practice, what that means for you as practitioners. So I'm just going to share my screen. Okay. So what this now means is I can't see you. So if you have questions or comments, please put them in the chat. Okay. So I'm just going to introduce myself. I've introduced myself, but the BASW Criminal Justice Group as well. So I'm co-chair with Caroline of the Criminal Justice Group, and we're a bit of a motley crew of people with a vested interest of BASW members, vested interest in youth justice and criminal justice more widely, and kind of key issues facing the sector at the moment. And we meet quarterly as part of that group and try and make decisions and have an impact on the sector and think about the areas that we want to target. So if you wouldn't mind, if you could please introduce yourselves in the chat, including your name and your current role and something about what brought you here today, that would be great. And if you can please remain muted until the Q&A or when you're asked to post. I will be asking you to do some thinking as we go along. And then post some responses in the chat. Okay, so if anything comes up for you, please post it in the chat and we'll come back to that in a while. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to look at current data. Not all the current data, can't fit it all in, but some of the current data on the youth justice system, quite a bit of which is drawn from the latest youth justice stats that take us up to March last year, and some information from the Home Office and other bits and pieces of reports and data. We're going to have a look at what this means and hopefully think about implications for your practice. And really think about how we can affect change in the sector and what kind of things you'd like to target and what you're seeing on the ground, I hope. And to think then about our aims in the criminal justice group and have a follow-on discussion when we have the meeting later about, what this means for us and what we can do about it. I'm hoping my presentation won't last for too long, certainly no more than 30-40 minutes, and then we can have a larger group discussion. And as Caroline said, if there's anything you're not happy about that you want us to edit out, do let us know. It's absolutely fine. Okay. Okay. So I'm going to start with an overview of some statistics from the Ministry of Justice and the Youth Justice Board from their current statistical release, which took us up to March 21. Okay, so as many of you will know, there's been a decrease overall in the last 10 years of those cautioned or sentenced. There's been an 81% fall in first-time entrance to the youth justice system since March 2011, all of which sounds very positive. In terms of recorded knife crime, it's 14% lower over the last decade. And there's been a further reduction in statistics due to COVID-19. Okay, so some of that reduction is due to COVID-19 and the restrictions that we saw over that period. 3/4 of those remanded do not receive a custodial sentence, and we're going to spend a bit of time talking about that and talking about what's going on with remand and what we need to do about it, really. Because of that concern around increase in remands for young people and a reduction of those eventually sentenced to custody, there has been an amendment under the Police Crime and Sentencing Act of this year, which is obviously quite a contentious piece of legislation more widely, but it does address this issue of children on remand. So children on remand made up the highest proportion of the custodial population for the first time. Children spent on average of over 2 weeks longer on remand than the previous year. And that's likely due to restricted court activity, reduction in, the demand on court activity, really, including pauses to jury trials and the subsequent backlog of cases that we've seen under the pandemic. And I've put a quote in there for you. So they've said that the main objective of the proposals under the Act is to ensure that custodial remand is always used as a last resort. The Act strengthens the tests that the court must apply when deciding to remand a child to custody, where remand in the community is not appropriate. Okay, and we'll come back to the issue of remand later on, because it is a key issue that's been facing the sector in the last few years. Okay, so thinking about stop and search, which is sometimes, one of the first interactions that young people have with the criminal justice system, over half, 54% of all stop and searches of persons in the last year, so up to March 21, were of those aged 10 to 24 years. So over half of the stop and search demographic relates to young people. Okay. Of these, a good portion, 115,000, were under 18, so 17% of the total. Children accounted for almost half of the criminal damage searches, 3 in 10 of offensive weapons searches, a fifth of Public Order Act searches, and 13% of drug searches. Okay, but only 8.4% of those searches resulted in arrests. So it's a highly used strategy. It disproportionately affects young people, and it can, as we know, lead to very negative outcomes in terms of police relationships with young people. Okay. We know that stop and searches are carried out disproportionately against young people from minoritised ethnic backgrounds. So compared with stops of white people, the racial disparity of all stops, so I'm trying to move the little box there, from all stop and searches in the year ending March 21 was 7.1 times for black people, 2.6 times the white population for Asian people, other ethnic groups 1.6 times, and mixed ethnicity 2.3 times. So we know there's significant disparity in the ethnicity of people being stopped and searched. And I think there's a significant question of what we can do about that, really, given that it has been a real key policy agenda under the current government. It's something that keeps coming back in spite of substantial evidence to say that it's not effective and it can do more harm than good. Okay. So going back to the issue of remand, we know that of those on remand in youth custody, so not all remands, but thinking about custody, not community remands, the majority were in a young offender institute at 74%, which is a substantial figure. The majority were male at 98%, and that's a statistic that's remained broadly stable over the last decade. There's a disproportionality again in overrepresentation of minoritised ethnic groups at 60%, and there's also 60% aged 17, and that's an increase of 51% in the previous year. Okay. So thinking about what's going on with remand, why are we seeing the figures that we're seeing? So the majority of those on remand were convicted of violence against the person offended offences at 58%. And that might partially explain the increase in remand, along with that gap in remand to sentence. So we know that people, once they're on remand to custody, they stay there longer because of the backlog in the system. So they're not being let off remand, basically. So those figures partly explain the increase, but I'd like to know what you think. Okay, so what do you think is going on? Why are we seeing these increased remand figures? In terms of your own experience, what's happening in court? What's happening in the community? Are there other ways of explaining this statistic that's got quite stuck? So if you want to put your responses in the chat, and I'll come back to those later on. Okay, thank you. Okay. So in terms of custody overall, there's been a reduction of the number of children in custody. It's fallen to its lowest level. So there's an average of 560 children in custody at any one time during the year, and that's a fall of 28% against the previous year. There's also a reduction overall in reoffending rates. A decrease of 3.6 percentage points in the last year and 4.1 percentage points in the year ending March 2010. So a consecutive year-on-year fall. Okay. And again, I'd like you to just think about and post your responses in the chat. How do we explain and understand this reduction overall? Okay, so what's going on? Yeah, so on the one hand, we're seeing that rise in remand figures, but we're seeing a decrease in the use of custodial sentencing. We know that there's been a reduction in young people coming into the youth justice system, which is really positive. But what are you seeing on the ground? How would you explain it? How do you understand it from your perspective as a practitioner? Okay. So again, if you'd like to post your responses in the chat, and we'll come back to those in a while. Okay. So it's not all good news. While we see these positive statistics in terms of reductions of people coming into the system, reductions in custody rates, there are continuing disparities in some areas of significant concern. Okay. So Asian children accounted for 60% of children receiving a cautionable sentence in the last year, and that was the highest proportion on record for that group in the last decade. There were 21% fewer Asian children receiving a caution or sentence compared with the previous year. So over the decade it's increased, but in the last year there has been a decrease. The proportion of children caution or sentenced who are black has been increasing over the last 10 years and is now 5 percentage points higher than it was over a decade ago. Okay, so that's a significant increase, and we know that that is a persistent problem, and a report came out in January this year showing that racial disparity is a significant problem within the youth justice system. Children from a mixed ethnic background accounted for 10% of those receiving a caution or sentence in the latest year, so more than doubling in the past decade. Okay. So The Guardian reported in 2019, so before the pandemic, that They examined all cases passing through Greater Manchester Youth Courts in August 2019, and of those defendants whose ethnicity they could establish, 36% were from Black, Asian or minoritised ethnic communities. All were male and many were also in the care system. Only 22% of Greater Manchester's youth population are not white. So that's a significant disparity when you look at the wider population. Okay. And that came from a particular study, and I've put the link there for you. So thinking about girls and young women, the Young Women's Justice Project reported that the majority of young women aged 17 to 25 in the criminal justice system have a history of violence, abuse or trauma, which is connected to or drives their offending. So, for example, being coerced into crime by a partner or being sexually exploited or using drugs and alcohol to cope with their circumstances. Other issues include poor mental health, exclusion from education, economic inequalities and racism. Black, Asian and minoritised young women and those with experience of the care system are significantly overrepresented among young women who've come into contact with the criminal justice system, with Black, Asian and minoritised women forced to endure systemic racism and young women who've been in care facing additional stigma and negative stereotypes. Okay, and that was compiled by Agenda and the Alliance for Youth Justice, and again the link is there if you want to pursue that report. Okay. So a thematic review of custodial outcomes for girls and young women was conducted by the Inspectorate for Prisons, and they found that the national system overall was frail. While the youth custody service leaders preferred to place girls in secure children's homes, legislation requires that secure children's home managers refuse a placement if they feel they can't meet that girl's needs. In principle, the legislation is meant to protect children from being placed in unsuitable secure children's homes, but in practice it means that managers can refuse to offer a girl a place, and girls with the highest level of need are concentrated in Wetherby YOY in the Keppel unit quite often. And that's the institution with some of the fewest resources that's come under scrutiny this year, and I'll look at that in a while. Okay. So basically, I'm a little bit uncomfortable about aspects of this statement because it kind of puts all the onus on secure children's home managers rather than looking at what's going on for girls to be in the system in the first place. It's something that I found quite frustrating in practice when young women I met who had been very heavily abused, often on multiple occasions over time. Were being placed in custody because essentially people didn't really know what else to do with them. And certainly for some of those young women, I felt there was a question of whether or not they had capacity at the time that they were offending. So I don't know that going down the criminal route was best for them, but it feels like that's often the way it goes when actually there's a gap in mental health support and other kinds of support for young women and girls. So thinking about sentencing, there were 12,200 sentences overall up to March 21, and that's a decrease of 28%, and some of that is likely due to COVID-19 restrictions. From time to arrest, from arrest to completion, the time between arrest and completion increased by 47 days to 219. Again, that's connected to COVID-19 and the backlog that we're seeing in the system. Custodial sentence length has increased in the last decade to 16.8 months on average from 11.4. So there's less young people going to custody, but when they do, they tend to spend more time there, possibly because those that go to custody are committing more serious offences. The proportion sentencing on indictable offences increased for Black children by 5% from 16 to 21%. While the amount of children in custody has reduced overall substantially in the last 10 years, the use of custody within overall sentencing had remained broadly the same. So it took me a minute to figure out what that meant, and basically it means that the use of custody proportionally has remained the same in terms of how young people are dealt with. So in terms of what happens when young people arrive in custody, serious issues persist with regards to the way that children's time is occupied in the secure estate, particularly in YOIs, as shown by a recent inspection of Wetherby and the Keppel unit. So the inspection found that time out of the cell at Wetherby had not improved since the last inspection, and children received on average 6 hours a day out of their cell during the week and 4 hours at weekends. This average masked the very little time out of the cell, less than 2 hours a day, experienced by a large number of children. Progress had been hindered by delays to a reprofiling exercise for operational staff and uncertainty around the new educational contract. The latter was due to start 3 weeks after the visit, but prison and education leaders had yet to see it and had different views about what would be included. Depressingly, this meant that it was unlikely that children would see improvements before 2023. And that, I think, just kind of summarises some of the worst aspects of what's going on for young people in the youth justice system. So while improvements have been made, there are less young people being drawn into the system. Those certainly that are in custody are often having a really bleak experience. And I think we have to, we have to consider, what does it mean to be sent to custody? What is the purpose of a custodial sentence? Is it about removing a young person's liberty? Is it about meaning they can't be in the community? What is the nature of that punishment? Because this, for me, is a kind of extra dimension of having, being in a cell for the majority of that time. And we know in terms of young people's ability to cope and get back into life in the community, these kind of statistics are not going to help. Okay. So in terms of, there was some data, I was hoping to find a bit more data, and please point me in the right direction if you know where I can find it, on outcomes of community sentences more widely and what's going on, what kind of sentences, in terms of the YRO, what kind of sentences are being passed, but I couldn't find it. So if you know where I can find it, let me know. So I found some data on the impact of COVID-19 on community sentencing, which I thought was quite interesting. So in terms of how children have been worked with in recent years, in the last sort of 2-3 years, practitioners have often had restricted access to facilities, reducing both group and one-to-one encounters overall. More interventions have been delivered in the community, with an increase in one-to-one sessions and the use of informal spaces such as parks and gardens, as well as community venues such as youth centres. This is a positive development, provided that confidentiality can be assured and that alternative safe arrangements are possible for children presenting as high risks to staff. So that's from the Justice Inspectorate this year on their review of the impact of COVID-19. So COVID had a significant adverse impact on those already struggling in school, who were often further excluded or disengaged as a result of what happened to education during that time. There was an increase in demand on children and young people's mental health provision as a result of COVID, and that leads to a decline in provision overall and availability of services for those who perhaps most need them. 2/3 of youth offending services were rated good or outstanding under inspection. So there are, it's kind of a mix really of findings, some quite negative, and some, showing that good work is going on. Youth offending staff generally have smaller caseloads than child protection teams. However, they're often working with very complex cases. And we know that young people who come into the youth justice system now often have long-standing enduring issues and are some of the most vulnerable in our society. Okay, so from Her Majesty's Inspectorate Data 2019, the Chief Inspector of Probation said that children and young people are not getting the help they need to prepare for release, so thinking about resettlement and to resettle back into the community. There are specific programmes to help individuals prepare for release, but none of the people in their sample had attended one. Staff in youth offending teams had little knowledge often of what activities had taken place in custody and weren't able to build on any positive work, therefore, in the community. Many needed help to find accommodation or to pursue education, training or employment. Those with substance misuse and mental health issues also need support in the community, and they commented if the right services are not in place, these often vulnerable people are being set up to fail. So again, there's a lack of follow through between custody and what happens in the community. Inspectors often found frequent examples of poor planning. The Chief Inspector of Prisons, Peter Clark, said in some cases planning started just 10 days prior to release or even after release, and that's too little too late to be effective. A lot of the activity we saw in custody focused on containing children and young people, managing their behaviour or simply trying to fill in time. So again, you know, very poor representation of the kind of work that's undertaken with young people in custody, but also where work was taking place, there wasn't necessarily connection to then what followed in the community. And these are this is long-standing information, and it's sad to hear that it hasn't improved in recent years because this isn't new. The situation's an ongoing issue. Okay. So the sounds to have been of looking for positivity, the sound to have been some positive developments in some respects. I'd be interested to know about your perspective on this as well. So the government has committed £100 million funding increase for the Youth Justice Service, Youth Justice System, and it sounds to be geared towards early intervention, because when I read that I thought, are they plumbing all of that into custody? Is that all going to pay for secure schools? But it sounds like it's there was a mention of early intervention, which made me feel more positive. So there was also the developments of a SEND partnership, but no immediate obligation from what I could gather for the YJS or what YOS is to be involved, and it will be an important development, so it's important that we're able to contribute into that. Okay, so I'm going to open us up to a wider group discussion. If we were on Zoom, I'd put you in breakout groups, but we decided we'd do it as a larger group. Okay, so I just want us to think about the areas that I've touched on in this presentation. And just feedback really. What are you seeing? Okay, what can we do about it? And what do we think about these things? Why are these issues persisting? What's going on? I know some people have put in the chat. I'll just feed back some points from the chat. Okay. Thank you for telling us who you are and where you're from. That's great. People from all over the place, around the country. Fabulous. Care leaving team, independent social workers, social worker practicing in Bolton. Okay, liaison and diversion in the West Midlands. Okay, that's great, thank you. Somebody from the Youth Justice Board, thank you, great to see you. Okay, so please feedback. What are we making of this? What's happening? What can we do about it? I always feel quite despondent reading some of the statistics, but I try and stay positive. So I'd really like to hear from those of you in practice. What's your experience? So Kat commented, we're managing higher risk young people in the community, recognising custodial sentences do not lead to better outcomes for young people. Working closer with partner agencies, absolutely. Remand, increased due to lack of safe and appropriate placements for children. Yeah, it's quite worrying, isn't it? And children who can't stay at home with no family options. So I think that kind of alludes to a concern that I have, Kat, which is that custody is often used on welfare grounds when appropriate options have perhaps run dry. You know, I've certainly known young people who've been sent to custody when they really needed a better a residential placement or a better deal from the care system, really. Beth, I've seen that those remanded are repeat offenders or very high risk offences, however, less young people being arrested in the first place. Yeah. So there are some positives, and I think, widely it is acknowledged that those in the system now pose a higher risk of serious offending quite a lot of the time. But we also know there's a backlog in getting young people off remand once they're there. Yeah, there are statistics, Ali. I've just seen your comment. You'd be interested to see what proportion of young people are considered to have special education needs. There is information about that. I don't have it in front of me, but it's a high proportion of those involved in youth offending. Okay, for sure. Okay, so if anybody wants to kind of contribute, feel free to unmute, and we can start a discussion.
I work for the YJB, but I'm not a practitioner. I haven't practiced for a long time. I haven't spoken to a child for a long time. But what I got out of what I've got so far, and what I totally agree with in the chat, and it was really good to see, it is this balance, or the difference between higher risk of harm, of offending, that children are going to get remanded. But what came out in the chat was where the comment about judges being reluctant to remand to the community because they think there aren't appropriate placements in the community. So for welfare grounds, they're remanding. And that sort of suggests that if we in the community were able to put up a better case to a judge or to a sentencer, to a magistrate, if we had stronger better facilities for higher risk, higher need children, then they might be more tempted to consider that. And it's because there aren't a lot of alternatives for all sorts of reasons. So to me, that's a positive in a sense. That's a way forward. There is something that we can actually do, because by trying to provide better alternatives.
Yeah, absolutely. So how can we create confidence, among sentences that actually we can safeguard young people and victims in the community? It's difficult, isn't it? Because again, thinking back to when I was in practice, last time a few years ago, there were certainly instances where, so if I say a looked after child, there was a reluctance to look at appropriate placements depending on what happened in court. So it's kind of like social care was waiting for a court outcome to see if they had to decide on a new placement before looking for, alternatives where things perhaps weren't very solid in the existing placement for young people in care. So there sometimes feels like a bit of people hedging their bets and thinking, okay, they might go over to youth justice, so they won't be our primary responsibility anymore. We'll see if they get remanded. And that's the wrong way round, and that always gave me significant cause for concern.
One other brief thing I'll throw in as well, I think, because the numbers in custody have gone down quite significantly, there are a lot of youth offending, youth justice services around the country, England and Wales, that they may only get one child a year that goes into custody or is at risk, and therefore all of their sort of practice, all of their understanding, all of the things to do when that happens, they're not, it's unusual rather than business as usual. So I don't want to say people have lost this sort of expertise or anything like that. It's just this idea that, well, maybe, if someone's getting remanded once a week, then you sort of have systems and you have processes and everything else. And it's the same with children coming out of custody as well. When they're coming out, all the processes that are in place, they're not as perhaps not as in place as they could be.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, so I guess some of that is about better joint working, isn't it, between social care, between youth offending, yeah, and having a shared purpose. Because from from the youth justice side, I always felt like I was working really hard to keep young people out of custody and off remand, but that's not necessarily mirrored elsewhere. If you don't have those kind of shared values, it's quite difficult at times.
Yeah, I mean, I put the comment up there in terms of, I think for children on community sentences, we are managing much higher risk young people in the community with partner agencies. We've certainly done a huge amount of work in Somerset in terms of trying to do that. However, I was in court last Friday and we've got a young person on remand at the moment, and he is there to protect the public, but he is also there on welfare grounds. But there are no national care placements for him. There is nowhere. There are no family members, and therefore he was on a child protection plan previously, which clearly didn't work. And they've done a national search, and we are at the mercy of private providers who, no, thank you very much, I'll take somebody else who's much lower risk. So if we were to be able to find him a care placement, we would try and manage him in the community. I don't know how anybody else feels about kind of the whole youth justice versus care issue at the moment, but you know, certainly not unique in Somerset.
Thanks, Kat. Yes, I do have a feel for what you're saying in terms of not only is it hard sometimes to secure placements, but it's hard to have the confidence that they will meet the needs, you know, of the court in reducing remands and protecting the public. And if we could, yeah, it's difficult, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think, sorry, I'm just going to butt in again, but the backlog in cases is having a huge impact with our young people. We've got young people coming through now, and we've had a sentence last week of a young person for sexually harmful behaviour where it's 2.5 years since the offences occurred. Particularly harmful sexual behaviour cases, there is such a huge backlog and time period between the offence occurring, the offence being disclosed, the investigation taking place. And I understand from many conversations with our police colleagues that it is around forensic, it's around a backup in the system in itself. But we've got somebody who for the last 2.5 years has been in the community, no bail conditions, released under investigation. We've had no input, no involvement with them, and now all of a sudden they're sentenced and we've got them on a 10-month youth rehabilitation order, and we're doing an AIM assessment with them, and it feels like we'll do it. He's nearly 18. We should have been in several years ago supporting this young person. So, you know, we've got young people who have been through their 18th birthday, and by the time they get to court and they're convicted, they're an adult. So then we're looking at, okay, what is the appropriate adult sentence for someone who committed an offence as a juvenile? So there's a huge issue in terms of backlog and waiting, particularly in Crown Prosecution Service. And I don't know what we do with that. We challenge at a local level, and we take it back to our Youth Justice Board representative, and I know that they go back and challenge, but it's massive in terms of working with traumatised young people who are very complex, who are a year on from the offence occurring.
Yeah, that's really difficult, isn't it? Because I would imagine that youth cases carry some priority in terms of who's at the front of that backlog, but that's really tricky because that's not, and there's nothing that we can do really to fix that one easily without, you know, thinking about strikes among the judiciary and different things. There's a lot going on, isn't there, that would impact on bringing that number down. Thanks, Kat, that's really helpful. Anybody else? Any thoughts about any other aspects?
Yeah, I was just going to pick up on the kind of, I tend to work with adults, but I've been working with adults who have had really like traumatic upbringings and then been in prison for offences on really long sentences, and then when they're in hospital they're being diagnosed, in prison they're being diagnosed. So it really is about early intervention, isn't it? It really is about understanding that child holistically at that time, rather than once they get in prison, start looking at them and doing those assessments. But I don't know what the answers are, Helen. It's like other than investment, investing in more in young people. But it sounds like it's going the other way. If young people are waiting so long to be sentenced and to on remand and so on. But I just think there's a lot more going on, and it could be dealt with in a different way. And I've got I've worked with people who have been in prison for a long time on sexual offences, and I don't think, I can think of a couple, I don't think they have capacity around sex, and I don't think they have capacity around contact, and I don't think they'll ever regain it. So then it calls into question at the time of offending, did they have capacity, and was prison the right route, or actually should that person, because I work with a lot of people with learning disabilities and or autism, and the question is, should that person have even went into prison in the first place? You know, or is there another route around, you know, supporting that person in the community, perhaps under dolls? So it's just interesting because I'm seeing things kind of later on in the process a lot of the time.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And how are you finding when we think about young people not being diagnosed until they enter custody, which isn't necessarily the best place? What are your kind of experiences of follow through in the community in terms of support for young people?
It's variable. It depends on local authority. If people see that it needs that level of investment, or I think a lot of it is if people are really like local authorities are really clued up, and the others involved are clued up on the Mental Capacity Act is often it hinges on. Because if people don't understand the Mental Capacity Act, they don't understand what you're talking about and what level of support you can actually provide to someone in the community, even if it is, you know, for a period of time. And then you can look at, I always make recommendations around education and so on. And whether that young person can have some bespoke education into their offending that's pitched at their level. Yeah. Because what I see is people going through the system and they have education in prison, and then they're kind of, or they're enrolled on programs in prison, but they're not actually appropriate for those programs, so they don't end up completing them, and it's kind of seen as a fail on their part. But actually it's because it's not pitched at their level for them to be able to understand it. Yeah, so there's that side of things, and also, you know, with maturity, people respond better to education sometimes, so there's that side of it as well. But I think really, if a care package has to be designed at what will keep this person out of prison, and usually it's having the right care team who understand that person and are not alarmist, so they're not, you know, if a young person expresses something, then it doesn't mean they're going to go out and commit a crime. It might mean that they're expressing that they're unhappy about something, and before it gets to that point of everyone going, this is like a huge warning sign, actually it's a warning sign for something else. How can we get in a little bit quicker and do that therapeutic work with that person? How can a team use behavioural support and diversion and so on, and engage in a meaningful activity?
Yeah, for sure. I think you make a really good point there about timing of things and whether or not someone's ready, you know, to receive the kind of service that's available. And that can often lead to offers of services withdrawing when actually, you know, they still need to be there. It's just about maybe more time is needed.
Yeah, or being at the right level for that person at that time. It might be that something that's appropriate at that time, you know, it might be appropriate later, but isn't at that time. And how are they going to, rather than trying to fit people into it, how are they going to provide something that fits around that person, fits that individual?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
I see your comment, Naomi, in the chat. I wonder whether the upcoming LPS safeguards would be an impact on young people in terms of community sentencing, but also those taking part in crimes who have been found to lack capacity at a later point in the process. And Beth saying, I tend to find that young people do not trust professionals to follow through and therefore don't engage in the first place. That's really sad, isn't it? You know, and I think that probably shows that they've been, you know, in a number of systems perhaps for a long period of time before coming to us, because I guess what we're seeing is that young people are entering the youth justice system at an older age in their adolescence, and and often where, you know, they're at a more serious point. So our role is often made harder because we don't meet them earlier on. That's not to say that we want to go back to where things were 20 years ago, where every child was being swept into the youth justice system, often on welfare grounds, and there were just too many having their needs met under the banner of criminal justice. But there's definitely a balance to be struck. Oh, liberty protection safeguards, thank you. Yeah, I hear you on the puppy chaos in the background. That's the difficulty of Zoom, isn't it? Okay, would anybody else like to come forward with a comment or a bit of feedback, or your thoughts on how things are at the moment and what you might be seeing in practice?
I'm probably by far and away the longest person out of practice, and I would arrogantly say probably the best informed here today, apart from you, Helen. A number of points I've resisted throughout, but I was anti the establishment of youth justice teams. I thought it would fragment services. I believe it has. I believe it has been, for a certain small group of people, children in particular, has been very beneficial. But what does concern me, and what has been said today, backs up all those concerns. Increasingly, social work is the dustbin service. It's picking up failures from education initially, parenting in the first place, education secondly, total absence of health services, mental health services, not only for children, but also for adults. This is constantly coming forth. The reason I believe so many people are being remanded is because there just is not appropriate care provision in the community. You know, only this last month there's been several references to local authorities paying up to £1 million a year to care for a single child. That is madness. You know, you don't have to have a mental health degree to decide that is madness. And it is incredible that is being allowed to go on. And in my distorted and personal view, that's caused by one thing, and that's the privatisation of care and the failure of central government to provide adequate care, adequate finances, both for education, mental health, and for social work. And I really don't know how we get out of it. I keep doing my little bit, and this last month I really have felt impotent, and it's not a feeling that I normally experience. I see myself as a long-term practitioner, an advocate who has worked really hard, and it all seems to be going nowhere. I'm sorry to be so negative about it, but I think the situation is dire. A factor that people do tend to overlook, though, is let's not forget about the closure of courts. The number of courts has been closed. We have barristers and other legal minds either on strike or failing to actually take on court work because it's so badly paid. They're currently on strike. The backlog is now something in the region of 4 years. And, you know, this is totally unacceptable. And we currently have a government which is not even talking about not making further cuts, you know, to all services. You know, this is madness. I'll shut up for the time being. I've got lots more to spin later. Thank you.
No, but that's a really good point. A number of really good points, but particularly on the reduction to legal aid funding, which has had an impact across the sector as well, and particularly for those most vulnerable, who are less likely to be able to access legal support to provide justice. So these things also have a significant impact, don't they?
Yeah.
And as you said, Francis, I was quite alarmed by that suggestion this morning that there are further cuts to public services, because I'm just thinking there's nothing left to cut. I don't know what else you're going to cut. And yet we see an increase in funding towards a secure estate for adults as well as children, and that's disturbing. That's just really alarming.
If I could just add a little more, I had a lovely comment about the proposed cuts. How do you get flesh off a skeleton?
Yeah,
absolutely.
Well, I think we're going to find out, aren't we? That's the worry.
It shows what a cynic I am.
Wayne.
Thank you, Helen. And thanks for your presentation earlier on, Helen. I thought it was really informative. I got a lot from it. Good afternoon, everybody. I've been here in the background just trying to sort of organise things for our event and our speaker today, Helen. Helen has been quite modest in that she is co-chair of the group as well. So I just want to kind of plug the group quickly before we end in the next 5 minutes. The group is co-chaired by Helen and Caroline Bald, who I think is with us but may have had to join via telephone. Francis, who's already spoken, is a previous chair and had been for many years and did lots of fantastic work for the group. So we're really trying to continue in the same vein. And I think the harmony that we have amongst us, both current chairs and ex-chair, is that we recognise that split between criminal justice and social work right through sort of policy practice of education and the sort of history behind that. I previously worked for a youth offending service in Sheffield and for the probation service many years ago, but you know, that's where I sort of started my career. So I've got a real passion really for this area of social work as I see it, but there is a real distinct split. So that is something this group has tried to bridge in lots of different ways. So without rambling on any further, just to really plug the group, and if it's of interest to you, if you want to join future meeting, so yeah, you know, please get involved. I'll hand back to Helen now.
Thanks, Wayne. Yes, please do, if you are a member of BASW, do join the group. That would be great. We really appreciate more. You know, we're trying to sort of expand the number of practitioners and people with lived experience of the criminal justice system in terms of the group membership. And we do decide priorities and things we want to campaign on, basically. Just a feedback on a comment in the chat before we wrap up. Kat saying the multi-agency nature of youth justice teams is the envy of my colleagues. Having access to a multitude of professionals and case management systems is one of the key features of the system that does work. I do agree regarding the national picture of care placements. Thanks for that, Kat. I must admit, I came into youth justice just as youth offending teams were starting. So that's the youth justice system that I know. And I agree, and a lot of research states that that model of multi-agency working that certainly used to be practiced in youth offending teams can be very effective. I think the problem was that it unfortunately provided services to children that should have been dealt with on welfare grounds rather than being captured in the criminal justice system. So thank you for that. I'm going to wrap up unless there's any final questions or comments. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Helen.